Oh, hello there. You must be ready for quarantine bedtime story time. Well, I brought a couple books tonight. Let me just get comfortable over here. Welcome everyone to Volume 4 of Bedtime Storytime. This is the quarantine edition, of course. We're gonna have a little bit of water. I've been out all day. Cheers to everyone out there. This is to your health. I hope everyone is having a good time to reflect and to revolutionize. Cheers. Well, I have a good selection of books here for you guys tonight, but first I want to do a little introduction. First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining in. As Temelotzin, the Aztec poet, said, we're all here on this earth on loan to each other because our lives are, a gift. So thank you everyone for lending me your time and your ears. Very happy to be lending you my time and my voice. I've mentioned before or last time that one of the reasons I'm doing this live stream is because I want to promote actual physical literature, and I like reading out of books. So I want to remind everyone that there are many ways to order books besides the major retailers. I just put in an order today with Heyday Books. They do a lot of great, they publish a lot of great books from the area, including some that I've read in the past. Definitely check them out. Definitely check out some independent booksellers. A lot of them have online stores or third parties that work with them. I also, one of the big reasons why I decided to do this live stream is because I want to promote California natural and indigenous history. California really is a magical place. Everyone that lives here feels that even though California is different now than it was before, and California has been a magical place for really a long time. And I want to honor that. So I want to say we're here on occupied Ohlone land during this quarantine. And I appreciate the ancestors of the land. For everyone who's had the chance to get outdoors more, I hope you have been. You probably have noticed the spring wildflowers. I've definitely been getting my hiking on safely, of course, but I want to recommend two things. First of all, if you end up in the Sierra Nevadas or really anywhere around California, check out this book, John Muir Laws, Sierra Nevada Wildlife. It has beautiful illustrations of different animals, very specific. And it's pretty easy to carry. It's a little bit heavy, but it's really beautiful. Probably easy for children to use. Also, they have the individual portions with wildflowers and stuff. It works for the coast approximately. The Sierras have different subspecies. And then for anyone in the Bay Area, I recommend this. You open it up, and there's some like different things in here. You can take these hiking with you. This is by the same illustrator. He actually teaches natural illustration. The reason why I think it's important to have these things is because when you learn the names of the things around you, the animals, the plants, even the types of rocks you're seeing, you really start to learn a lot about, or you really start to appreciate the land more. That'll lead to you wanting to work with the land, preserve, conserve, and hopefully, fight against the environment, take a real stance in fighting against the environmental destruction, because these plants and animals are now your friends and not just things that you've heard about in school before. Having said all of that, I want to get on to the story time. Shout out to Jesse Medina. He has read poetry at past Cumbia events that I've been a part of. And him, among other people who have read at the events, are big inspirations for me, wanting to be a part of that storytelling tradition that has been on for a long time and hopefully continues. Shout out to my band Calafia Armada, if any of y'all are watching. We'll do shows again one day, but until then, we're talking about working on some new material. And we still got some t-shirts if anyone wants any, hit me up. Without further ado, let me introduce the books. First, I want to finish the introduction, or the first paragraph, the first chapter of 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. We stopped about 2/3 the way. Then I want to read a story from The Inland Whale. This is a story of a collection of native tales from the Northern and Southern California, put together by Theodora Kroeber. The story I'm going to read is called Dance Mad, from the Wintu people around Redding. I want to read to y'all the first chapter of Ecotopia. I love reading the first chapter. This book by Ernest Callenbach imagines if California or the West Coast separated from the United States and took environmentalism super seriously. It's pretty great. It's entertaining, and the least something to think about. Lastly, or not lastly, but if we have time, after I read everything else, I want to read a little bit from this book of fantasy. It was edited by Jorge Luis Borges, but it's got stories from a lot of people, including excerpts. A lot of weird stuff in this book. I'm glad I'm able to use this. And then, of course, as always, to finish, Legends of the Yosemite Miwok. We'll read the story of He-Seek the Skunk, which I like to end with every time because I think the message in that is timeless. It's an anti-greed message. The Miwoks knew it, and we're on their land, and we got to know it too. So let's get going. Where did we leave off here? God dang it, shouted Jose Arcadio Buendia. Macondo is surrounded by water on all sides. The idea of a peninsular Macondo prevailed for a long time, inspired by the arbitrary map that Jose Arcadio Buendia sketched on his return from the expedition. He drew it in rage, evilly, exaggerating the difficulties of communication, as if to punish himself for the absolute lack of sense with which he had chosen the place. We'll never get anywhere, he lamented to Ursula. We're going to rot our lives away here without receiving the benefits of science. That certainty mulled over for several months in the small room he used as his laboratory, brought him to the conception of the plan to move Macondo to a better place. But that time, Ursula had anticipated his feverish designs. With the secrets and implacable labor of a small ant, she predisposed the women of the village against the flightiness of their husbands, who were already preparing for the move. Jose Arcadio Buendia did not know at what moment or because of what adverse forces his plan had become enveloped in a web of pretext, disappointments, and evasions until it turned into nothing but an illusion. Ursula watched him with innocent attention and even felt some pity for him on the morning when she found him in the back room, muttering about his plans for moving as he placed his laboratory pieces in their original boxes. She let him finish. She let him nail up the boxes. She let him put his initials on them with an inked brush without reproaching him, but knowing now that he knew, because she had heard him say so often in his monologues, that the men of the village would not back him up in their undertaking. Only when he began to take down the door of the room did Ursula dare to ask him what he was doing. He answered with a certain bitterness, "Since no one wants to leave, we'll leave all by ourselves." Ursula did not become upset. "We will not leave," she said. "We will stay here, because we had a son here." "We have still not had a death," he said. "A person does not belong to a place until there is someone dead under the ground." Ursula replied with a soft firmness, "If I have to die for the rest of you to stay here, I will die." Jose Arcadio Buendia had not thought that his wife's will was so firm. He tried to seduce her with the charm of his fantasy, with the promise of a prodigious world where all one had to do was sprinkle some magic liquid on the ground and the plants would bear fruit whenever a man wished, and where all manner of instruments against the pain were sold at bargain prices. But Ursula was insensible to his clairvoyance. Instead of going around thinking about your crazy inventions, you should be worried about your sons, she replied. Look at the state they're in, running wild just like donkeys. Jose Arcadio Buendia took his wife's words literally. He looked out the window and saw the barefooted children in the sunny garden, and he had the impression that only at that instant had they begun to exist, conceived by Ursula's spell. Something occurred inside him then, something mysterious and definitive that uprooted him from his own time and carried him adrift through an unexplored region in his memory. While Ursula continued sweeping the house, which was safe now from being abandoned for the rest of her life, he stood there with an absorbed look, contemplating the children until his eyes became moist and he dried them with the back of his hand, exhaling a deep sigh of resignation. All right, he said. Tell them to come help me take the things out of the boxes. Jose Arcadio, the older of the children, was 14. He had a square head, thick hair, and his father's character. Although he had the same impulse for growth and physical strength, it was early evident that he lacked imagination. He had been conceived and born during the difficult crossing of the mountains, before the founding of Macondo, and his parents gave thanks to heaven when they saw he had no animal features. Aureliano, the first human being to be born in Macondo, would be 6 years old in March. He was silent and withdrawn. He had wept in his mother's womb and had been born with his eyes open. As they were cutting the umbilical cord, he moved his head from side to side, taking in the things in the room and examining the faces of people with a fearless curiosity. Then, indifferent to those who came close to look at him, he kept his attention concentrated on the palm roof, which looked as if it were about to collapse under the tremendous pressure of the rain. Ursula did not remember the intensity of that look again until one day when little Aureliano, at the age of 3, went into the kitchen at that moment that she was taking a pot of boiling soup from the stove and putting it on the table. The child, perplexed, said from the doorway, "It's going to spill?" The pot was firmly placed in the center of the table, but just as soon as the child made his announcement, it began an unmistakable movement towards the edge, as if impelled by some inner dynamism, and it fell and broke on the floor. Ursula, alarmed, told her husband about the episode, but he interpreted it as a natural phenomenon. That was the way he was always, alien to the existence of his sons, partly because he considered childhood as a period of mental insufficiency, and partly because he was always too absorbed in his fantastic speculations. But since the afternoon when he called the children in to help him unpack the things in his laboratory, he gave them his best hours. In the small separate rooms, where the walls were gradually being covered by strange maps and fabulous drawings, he taught them to read and write and do sums, and he spoke to them about the wonders of the world, not only where his learning had extended, but forcing the limitations of his imagination to the extremes. It was in that way that the boys ended up learning that in the southern extremes of Africa, there were men so intelligent and peaceful that their only pastime was to sit and think, and that it was impossible to cross the Aegean Sea on foot by jumping from island to island all the way to the port of Salonika. Those hallucinating sessions remained imprinted on the memories of the boys, in such a way that many years later, a second before the regular army officer gave the firing squad the command to fire, Colonel Aureliano Buendia saw once more the warm March afternoon on which his father had interpreted the lesson in physics and stood fascinated, with his hand in the air and his eyes motionless, listening to the distant pipes, drums, and jingles of the gypsies, who were coming to the village once more, announcing the latest and most startling discoveries of the sages of Memphis. They were new gypsies, young men and women who knew only their language. handsome specimens with oily skins and intelligent hands, whose dances and music sowed a panic of uproarious joy through the streets, with parrots painted all colors reciting Italian arias, and hen who laid 100 golden eggs to the sound of a tambourine, and a trained monkey who reads minds, and the multiple use machine that could be used at the same time to sew on a button and reduce fevers, and the apparatus to make a person forget his bad memories, and a poultice to lose time, and 1,000 more inventions so ingenious and unusual that Jose Arcadio Buendia must have wanted to invent a memory machine so that he could remember them all. In an instant, they transformed the village. The inhabitants of Macondo found themselves lost in their own streets, confused by the crowded fair. Holding a child by each hand so as not to lose them in the tumult, bumping into acrobats with gold-capped teeth and jugglers with 6 arms, suffocated by the mingling breath of the manure and sandals that the crowd exhaled, Jose Arcadio Buendia went about everywhere like a madman, looking for Melquiades, so that he could reveal to him the infinite secrets of that fabulous nightmare. He asked several gypsies who did not understand his language. Finally, he reached the place where Melquiades used to set up his tent, and he found a taciturn Armenian, who in Spanish was hawking a syrup to make oneself invisible. He had drunk down a glass of the amber substance in one gulp as Jose Arcadio Buendia elbowed his way through the absorbed group that was witnessing the spectacle and was able to ask his question. The gypsy wrapped him in the frightful climate of his look before he turned into a puddle of pestilential and smoking pitch over which the echo of his reply still floated, "Melquiades is dead." Upset by the news, Jose Arcadio Buendia stood motionless, trying to rise above his affliction until the group dispersed, called away by other artifices, and the puddle of the taciturn Armenian evaporated completely. Other gypsies confirmed later on that Melquiades had in fact succumbed to the fever on the beach of Singapore, and that his body had been thrown into the deepest part of the Java Sea. The children had no interest in the news. They insisted that their father take them to see the overwhelming novelty of the sages of Memphis. It was being advertised at the entrance of a tent that, according to what was said, had belonged to King Solomon. They insisted so much that Jose Arcadio Buendia paid the 30 reales and led them into the center of the tent, where there was a giant with a hairy torso and a shaved head, with a copper ring in his nose, a heavy iron chain on his ankle, watching over a pirate chest. When it was opened by the giant, the chest gave off a glacial exhalation. Inside, there was only an enormous transparent block with the infinite internal needles in which the light of the sunset was broken up into colored stars. Disconcerted, knowing that the children were waiting for an immediate explanation, Jose Arcadio Buendia ventured a murmur. "It's the largest diamond in the world." "No," the gypsy countered. "It's ice." Jose Arcadio Buendia, without understanding, stretched out his hand toward the cake, but the giant moved it away. "5 reales more to touch it," he said. Jose Arcadio Buendia paid them and put his hand on the ice and held it there for several minutes as his heart filled with fear and jubilation at the contact with mystery. Without knowing what to say, he paid 10 more reales so that his sons could have that prodigious experience. Little Jose Arcadio refused to touch it. Aureliano, on the other hand, took a step forward and put his hand on it, withdrawing it immediately. "It's boiling!" he exclaimed, startled. But his father paid no attention to him, intoxicated by the evidence of the miracle. He forgot at that moment about the frustration of his delirious undertakings and Melquiades' body, abandoned to the appetite of the squids. He paid another 5 reales, and with his hand on the cake, as if giving testimony on the Holy Scripture, he exclaimed, "This is the great invention of our time." What a man. That's the first chapter of 100 Years of Solitude. Incredible writing, a great translation here. that phrase, "it's boiling," anyone who's gone swimming with me in the Sierras, that "it's boiling" is usually what I say when the river is just about too cold to swim in. That's where that comes from. All right. Let's see what we have here. I want to move on to a legend that's ascribed to the Wintu people. They traditionally inhabited the area around Redding, and there's still a lot that live around there. These stories were translated and are very beautiful. The book is The Inland Whale. Oh, there's an illustration here. The story is called Dancing Mad. It sometimes happens when many people are gathered together for dancing and singing and feasting, that one or another of those who are dancing does not stop when the others stop, does not eat or sleep or rest, but goes on dancing and dancing. He goes dance mad. Once long ago, a whole people went dance mad, and dancing while the moons and seasons came and went, dancing all around the world. It began one day of spring, after the heavy winds had quieted, and the bare ground was green with young clover. In a village on Swift Creek, midway between the top edge of the world, there were the three principal rivers and small streams, and the lower edge of the world, where these rivers, wide and deep, flowed together to make the Nam Ti Pom, that is, the Sacramento River, and empty into the sea. This village, like the sea and the rivers, was old, its people unchanged in their ways since the world was made. The occasion was a feast celebrating the initiation into full womanhood of Namtaimet, the daughter of one of the village families. Namtaimet's father and mother had neglected nothing of the customary observances and training belonging to this period in a girl's life. They knew that it was an important and indeed a dangerous time for her, and for others too, if she does not learn to keep its prohibitions, to follow its complex rituals, and to behave with decorum. Namtaimet's mother built for her daughter a little house. Here, separated from the family but close by, she lived alone during the moons of her initiation. She fasted and kept to herself, seeing only her mother and her mother's mother, who brought her food, bathed her, combed her hair, and cared for her, for she was not allowed by old custom to touch herself. She left the little house only after dark, and then briefly, keeping her head covered and her face screened from sight, all the time she was outside. She spent the long days and nights inside and alone, doing only those tasks appropriate to her state, learning from her mother and her grandmother the role and behavior of a good woman and wife. She learned that on the day and the night before her husband should go to a hunt or fight or gamble, she must help him to avoid her and by no means tempt him to sleep with her, for this would spoil his luck. She learned that she must again help him to avoid her during all of her moon periods until she was an old woman unable to bear him children, that she must live in her own separate house during these times, apart from her husband. There were further rules of continence and food prohibitions, which she must faithfully follow each time she should be with child. Each rule and prohibition came embedded in ritual, song, and story, and these too she learned. When the long moons of learning and fasting and praying came to an end, her mother and her grandmother were more than satisfied with her behavior and her knowledge. They and her father and her mother's and her father's brothers and sisters made a feast in her honor, sending runners to invite people from the village all up and down Swift Creek to come to feast and dance and sing with them. Her young friends, boys and girls, had sing to her often in the evening outside of her little house to let her know she was not forgotten. But she never broke the rule. She neither looked out nor showed herself nor answered them. They were as happy to have her back as she was to be there, and now the young married woman came up and talked to her as if she was already a grown woman and one of the group. Namtaimet emerged from her long seclusion, pale, much changed, and very beautiful. The old as well as the young exclaimed at her beauty, while the old recalled that a girl is never so beautiful as at this time when she is newly returned to the world from her long initiation. She was carefully dressed for her great day. Her new buckskin skirt was elaborately ornamented with shells and beads. In her ears were enormous polished shell earrings, and about her neck many strings of beads, which half covered her breasts. Her hair, washing and shining, hung in two thick braids, tied with mink. She carried rattle, made from the deer's hooves, and a slender willow staff, given to her by the young married women to symbolize her coming of age. The women who were not taken up with cooking or caring for children gathered around Namtaimet, admiring her. First one man and then another joined them until someone said, "We should dance. We are enough to make a circle dance." Holding hands and singing, they formed a moving circle around Namtaimet, dancing the old circle dance, which had been the coming-of-age dance for girls since the beginning of time. Hearing the singing and the familiar rhythm of the shuffling sidestep of the dance, the old men and women came from their fires in their houses, and the children, who were big enough to dance, came with them, all of them joining the moving circle, which grew bigger and bigger. The only ones not dancing were the women who were pounding acorns or stirring food, which was being cooked in large baskets in preparation for the feast. One by one, even they put down their pestles and their stirring paddles and became part of the circle. They circled and sang until above the stamp of their dancing feet came the echo of distant voices and the silken sound of arrows flying swiftly overhead. The dancing stopped while the people from the neighboring village appeared from behind the hills, running, shouting, and singing, the young men among them releasing arrows to whir level over the heads of the dancers. In this way, the guests came to the village, and there were greetings and talking and laughing until Namtaimet's father invited them all to eat. Ooh, sounds wild. It was a great feast. For 10 days and 10 nights, they ate and sang and danced. At last, the feasting was over. The 10th night of singing and dancing came and went, but the pale dawn of the 11th day found all those people still dancing. They kept right on dancing, all of them. They went dance mad. In a long time, singing as they went, they danced up the trail leading out of the village to the east. Soon the last house was left behind, and they were dancing among the hills they knew, the hills of home, up and over them until they could no longer see their houses. Through briars and chaparral, over rocks and rough ground, up and down the hills, they danced on and on. It is possible to retrace much of their journey around the world, for it is known that they came to the Trinity River, the first of the great rivers, and that they forded this river as they forded all streams, by dancing straight across them. On the far side of the Trinity, there is a flat, open, and bare today as it was then, where the dancers again formed in a circle, and danced the round dance. In a line once more they danced on east through the gap in the hills to the hay fork, and across it up the steep ridge and beyond. At the top of the ridge they found a spring, Paukau Kunmen. Here they stopped to rest and drink from the spring. You can still see the large basins in the rocks where they sat. This was their first resting place. From Paukau Kunmen, they danced down the other side of the ridge. They might have become faint from hunger, except that they learned to gather berries and to catch small animals without breaking the rhythm of their dance, crossing ridge after ridge, fording small streams, and so finding themselves at last on the banks of Middle River, the McLeod. Here they made their second resting place. By this time, their moccasins were cut to pieces, and nothing much but belts and a few maple bark and buckskin shreds of aprons remained on their for their clothes. They did not try to replace their worn-out clothing. Instead, they filled their pouches with clays and dyes for their face and body paint, and for the rest of their dancing trip, they wore no clothes at all, keeping their face and bodies freshly painted. The dancers were far, far from home now, farther than any of them had ever been, in country they knew only from the tales that had been told to them by the old ones. The old ones themselves knew only so much as was learned from the occasional meeting with strangers who had rarely and at some earlier time wandered west as far as Swift Creek. Strangers who spoke in the same tongue and observed the same way of life, but who nonetheless lived far from the center of the world and close to the borderlands of people of other ways and tongues. The dancers found Middle River country much as they had been told it was. That is to say, a rich country of many people and many deer, of bushes loaded with hazelnuts and berries of many sort. There was an abundance for all, and they hunted and gathered and ate there by the river, growing fat and sleek while they made friends with the people of the Middle River. One of the things they learned from their new friends was to catch and cook salmon, something which, strange as it seems now, they had not known about. With this fresh salmon diet, they felt new strength and new power, and they set off dancing again. They were no longer interested in hunting and gathering. They wished only to dance, and then to fish and cook and eat more salmon. So now they danced close beside one stream or another, wherever the salmon were best, learning the names of the many different kinds of salmon, their size and appearance, and their favorite rivers. Dancing and fishing, they went farther and farther downstream as the season drew on and the salmon swarmed shorter distances upstream to spawn. Having left home in the time of winds and new clover, they had by now passed the warm moon's dancing and spearing salmon. As the leaves began to dry and fall from the trees, the dancers were on the banks of the third great river, the Pit. And dancing far, far to the south, they came where the rivers join for their trip to the sea. They were in a country different from any they knew, even by report from the old ones, a country whose people spoke in a tongue they did not understand. The land on both sides of the lower Sacramento River stretches as far as the eye can see, marshy, swampy, and full of water birds. They danced through the marshes and swamps and among the water birds until came to them the smell of salt in the air. Leaving the marshes behind, they danced down the Sacramento where it broadens at its mouth, and they stood and watched it empty into the sea. Wearied at last of watching, they danced again, this time on the lower rim of the earth where the river meets the sea. Keeping to the rim, they turned their backs to the river, dancing away from the Nam Ti Palm towards the north. The time of the dead leaves was past. The fog moon came and went, and it was already the time of the mud moon and of frosts. They saw all about them storms and rain and floods, but there on the lower rim of the earth there were no storms, and they continued to dance along its sometimes rocky, sometimes sandy shore. The seasons of storms and cold, like the other seasons, came and went, blown away by the big winds of the awakening earth. And now the dancers turned inland, away from the sea, dancing and half blown towards home. They reached Swift Creek as the new clover was making a green mat on the earth, just as it had done when Nam Tai Met first came out of her seclusion at the beginning of the dance journey. The dancers were home, and the dance madness was no longer on them. It had lasted through all the moons and seasons, and had carried them all around the world. As long as she lived, Nam Tai Met told her children, as her children's children tell even today, of the feast her father made for her, and of the dance madness that came after it. Wow. Sounds like a story of the first tour of performers going through California. Beautiful story. Again, that's inland whale. Where are we at now? Well, I want to read a little bit of fiction. Nonfiction legends are nice, but it's always nice to read something from the modern imagination. So I'm going to read Ecotopia. This is a book that is currently on loan to my beautiful partner, Katie, whose house I'm enjoying right now during this quarantine. So, This book is about a fictional California where the environmental movement has taken over. Weston's next assignment, Ecotopia. The Times Post is at last able to announce that William Weston, our top international affairs reporter, will spend 6 weeks in Ecotopia beginning next week. This unprecedented journalistic development has been made possible through arrangements at the highest diplomatic level. California has separated from the United States here. It will mark the first officially arranged visit by an American to Ecotopia since the secession cut off normal travel and communications. The Times Post is sending Weston on this unique and difficult investigative assignment in the conviction that a candid, on-the-spot assessment of Ecotopia is essential 20 years after its secession. Old antagonisms have too long deterred those close examination of what has been happening in Ecotopia, a part of the world once near, dear, and familiar to us, but closed off and increasingly mysterious during its decades of independence. The problem now is not so much to oppose Ecotopia as to understand it, which can only benefit the cause of international good relations. The Times Post stands ready as always to serve that cause. Boy, it reminds me of real journalism. Here we go again, dear diary. May 3rd. A fresh notebook with all those blank pages waiting to be filled. Good to be on the way at last. Alleghenies already receding behind us like pale green ripples on an algae-covered pond. Thinking back to the actual beginnings of this trip, almost a year ago, those careful hints dropped at the White House like crumbs for the president's vacuum cleaner mind to suck up, until finally they coalesced into some kind of ball and came out of his own daring idea. Okay, send some unofficial figure out there, purely informal, a reporter not too closely identified with the administration, who could nose around, blow up a few pretty trial balloons. Can't hurt. A tingly moment when he finally breached it after a big Brazil briefing session. That famous confidential smile, and then saying that he had a little adventure in mind, wanted to discuss it with me privately. Was his tentativeness only his habitual caution, or a signal that if anything went wrong with the visit and the visitor were politically that the visit and the visitor were politically expendable? Still, an important opening in our foreign policy. Lots of weighty arguments for it. Heal the fratricidal breach that rent the nation, so the continent can stand united against the rising tide of starvation and revolution. Hawks who want to retake the lost lands of the West by force seem to be growing stronger, need neutralizing. Ecotopian ideas are seeping over the border more dangerously, can't be ignored any longer, might be detoxified by exposure, etc. Maybe we can find a hearing for a proposal to reopen diplomatic relations, perhaps trade proposals too. With reunification, a gleam in the eye. Even just a publicizable chat with Vera Alwyn could be useful. The president, with his customary flexibility, could use it to fend off both hawks and subversives. Besides, as I told Francine, who scoffed naturally after 5 brandies, I want to see Ecotopia because it's there. Can things really be as weird as they sound? I wonder. Have been mulling over the no-nos, must stay clear of the secession itself. Too much bitterness could still be aroused. But fascinating stories there. Probably how the secessionists filched uranium fuel from the power plants for the nuclear mines they claim to have set in New York and Washington. How their political organization, led by those damned women, managed to paralyze and then supplant the regular political structure and got control of the armories and the guard. How they bluffed their way to a standoff, helped of course by the severity of the national economic crisis that struck so conveniently for them. Lots of history there to be told someday, but now is not the time. Getting harder to say goodbye to the kids when I take off on a long trip. Not that it's really such a big deal, since I sometimes miss a couple of weekends even when I'm around. But with my being away so much seems to be beginning to bother them. Pat may be putting them up to it. I'll have to talk to her about that. Where else would Faye get the idea of asking to come along? Jesus, into darkest Ecotopia with typewriter and 8-year-old daughter. No more Francine for 6 weeks. It's always refreshing to get away for a while, and she'll be there when I get back, all charged up by some adventure or another. Actually, sort of exciting to think of being totally out of touch with her. And the editorial office, in fact, with the whole country. No phone service, wire service indirect, uncanny isolation the Ecotopians have insisted on for 20 years. And in Peking, Bantustan, Brazil, there always had to be an American interpreter who couldn't help dangling ties from home. This time there'll be no one to share little American reactions with. And it is potentially rather dangerous. These Ecotopians are certainly hotheads, and I could easily get into serious trouble. Government control over population seems to be primitive compared to ours. Americans are heartily hated. In a jam, the Ecotopian police might be no help at all. In fact, they aren't even armed. Well, ought to draft the first column. Midair, perhaps not the worst place to begin with. Williamson Weston on his journey to Ecotopia. On board TWA Flight 38, New York to Reno, May 3rd. As I begin this assignment, my jet heads west to Reno, last American city before the forbidding Sierra Nevada mountains that guard the closed borders of Ecotopia. The passage of time has softened the shock of Ecotopia's separation from the United States. And Ecotopia's example, it is now clear, was not as novel as it seemed at the time. Biafra had attempted secession from Nigeria but failed. Bangladesh had successfully broken free from Pakistan. Belgium had effectively dissolved into 3 countries. Now I'm from Belgium. It's an interesting proposal. Even the Soviet Union has had its separatist minority disturbances. Now this is an older book. Ecotopia's succession was partly modeled on that of Quebec from Canada. Such devolution has become a worldwide tendency. The sole important counter-development we can point to is the union of the Scandinavian countries, which perhaps only proves the rule, since the Scandinavians were virtually one people culturally in any event. Nonetheless, many Americans still remember the terrible shortages of fruit, lettuce, wine, cotton, paper, lumber, and other Western products which followed the breakaway of what had been Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. These problems exacerbated the general U.S. economic depression of the period, speeding up our chronic inflation and caused widespread dissatisfaction with government policies. Moreover, Ecotopia still poses a nagging challenge to the underlying national philosophy of America: ever-continuing progress, the fruits of industrialization for all, a rising gross national product. During the past 2 decades, we as a people have mostly tried to ignore what has been happening in Ecotopia, in the hope that it will prove mere foolishness and go away. It is clear by now, however, that Ecotopia is not going to collapse, as many American analysts at first predicted. The time has come when we must get a clearer standing of Ecotopia. If its social experimentation turns out to be absurd and irresponsible, it will then no longer tempt impressionable young Americans. If its strange customs indeed prove as barbaric as rumors suggest, Ecotopia will have to pay the cost in outraged world opinion. If Ecotopian claims are false, American policymakers can profit from the knowledge of that fact. For instance, we need to assess the allegation that Ecotopia has no more deaths from air and chemical pollution. Our own death rate has declined from a peak of 75,000 annually to 30,000 annually, still a tragic toll, but suggesting that measures of the severity adopted by Ecotopia are hardly necessary. How many deaths are acceptable, right? In short, we should meet the Ecotopia challenge on the basis of sound knowledge rather than ignorance and third-hand reports. My assignment during the next 6 weeks, therefore, is to explore Ecotopian life from top to bottom. to search out the realities behind the rumors, to describe in concrete detail how ecotopian society actually operates, to document its problems and, where it has called for, to acknowledge its achievements. By direct knowledge of the situation in which our former fellow citizens now find themselves, we may even begin to rebuild the ties that once bound them to the Union they so hastily rejected. Back to the journal, May 3rd. Reno, a sad shadow of its former good time self. With the lucrative California gambling trade cut off by secession, the city quickly decayed. The fancy casino hotels are now mere flop houses. Their owners long ago fled to Vegas. I walked the streets near the airline terminal, asking people what they thought of Ecotopia out there. Most replies non-committal, though I thought I could sometimes detect a tinge of bitterness. "Live and let live," said one grizzled old man. "If you can call what they do over there living." A young man who claimed to be a cowboy smiled at my question. "Well," he said, "I know guys who say they've gone over there to get girls. It isn't really dangerous if you know the mountain passes. They're friendly, all right, so long as you aren't up to anything. Know what, though? The girls all have guns. That's what they say. That could shake you up, couldn't it?" Had a hard time finding a taxi driver willing to take me over the border. Finally persuaded one who looked as if he had just done 20 years in the pen. Had to promise not only double fare, but 25% tips besides. For which I got a bonus of dirty looks and a string of reassuring remarks. "What'd you want to go there for anyhow? You're some kind of nut? Bunch of goddamn cannibals there. You'll never get out alive. I just hope I will." Next article, Crossing the Border into Ecotopia. On board the Sierra Express, Tahoe, San Francisco, May 4th. I have now entered Ecotopia, the first known American to visit the new country since its independence 19 years ago. My jet landed at Reno, though it is not widely known the Ecotopian government prohibits even international flights from crossing its territory on grounds of air and noise pollution. Flights between San Francisco and Asia, or over the pole to Europe, must not only use a remote airport 40 miles outside of the city, but are forced to follow over water routes, and American jets for Hawaii must fly via Los Angeles. Thus, to reach San Francisco, I was compelled to deplane at Reno and take an expensive taxi ride to the train station at the north end of Lake Tahoe. From Tahoe, there is a frequent and fast service. The actual frontier is marked by a picturesquely weathered wooden fence and a large gate, obviously little used. When my taxi pulled up, there was no one around. The driver had to get out, go over to a small stone guardhouse, and get the Ecotopian military to interrupt their card game. They turned out to be two young men in rather unpressed uniforms. But they knew of my coming. They checked my papers with an air of informed authority, and they passed the taxi through the gate, though only after making a point of the fact that it had required a special dispensation to allow an internal combustion engine to pass their sacred portal. I replied that it only had to take me about 20 miles to the train station. "You're lucky the wind is from the west," one of them said. "If it happened to be from the east, we might have had to hold you up for a little while." They checked my baggage with some curiosity, paying special attention to my sleeping pills. But I was allowed to keep everything except my trusty .45 and holster. What a journalist. This might have been standard garb in New York, I was told, but no concealable weapons are permitted in Ecotopia. Perhaps noticing my slightly uneasy reaction, one of the guards remarked that Ecotopian streets are quite safe by day or night. He then handed me a small booklet, Ecotopia Explains. This document was nicely printed, but with rather quaint drawings. Evidently, it had been prepared chiefly for tourists from Europe or Asia. "It might make things easier to get used to," said the other guard in a soft, almost insinuatingly friendly tone that I now begin to recognize as a natural trait. "Relax. It's a free country." "My friend," I countered, "I've been in a hell of a lot of stranger places than this country, and I relax when I feel like it. If you're finished with my papers, I'll be on my way." He snapped my passport shut, but held it in his hand. "Weston," he said, looking me in the eyes, "you're a writer. We count on you to use words carefully while you're here. If you come back this way, maybe you'll be able to use that word friend in good faith. We'd like that." He then smiled warmly and put out his hand. Rather to my surprise, I took it and found a smile on my own face as well. We drove on to the Tahoe station of the Ecotopian train system. It turned out to be a rustic affair constructed of huge timbers. It might pass in America for a monstrous ski chalet. It even had fireplaces in the waiting room, of which there are several. One a kind of restaurant, one a large deserted room with a bandstand where dances must have been held, and one a small quiet lounge with leather chairs and a supply of books. The trains, which usually have only one, two, or three cars, but run every hour, come into the basement of the station, and in cold weather, huge doors close behind them to keep out the snow and wind. Special facilities for skiers were evident, storage racks and lockers, but by this time of year, the snows have largely melted, and there's little skiing. The electric minibuses that shuttle from the station to the ski resorts and nearby towns are almost empty. I went down to my train. It looked more like a wingless airplane than a train. At first I thought I'd gotten into an unfinished car. There were no seats. The floor was covered with thick, spongy carpet and divided into compartments by knee-high partitions. A few passengers were sprawled on large bag-like leather cushions that lay scattered about. It's a train full of beanbag cushions. One elderly man had taken a blanket from a pile at one end of the car and laid down for a nap. Some of the others, realizing from my confusion that I was a foreigner, showed me where to stow my bag and told me how to obtain refreshments from the steward in the next car. I sat down on one of the pillows, realizing that there would be a good view from the huge windows that came down about 6 inches from the floor. My companions lit up some cigarettes, which I recognized as marijuana from the odor, and they began to pass them around. As my first gesture of international goodwill, I took a few puffs myself. Soon we were all sociably chatting away. Their sentimentality about nature has even led the Ecotopians to bring greenery into their trains, which are full of hanging ferns and small plants I could not identify. My companions, however, reeled off their botanical names with assurance. They must have been reading their John Muir Law guides. At the end of the car stood containers rather like trash bins, each with a letter, M, G, and P. These, I was told, are recycling bins. It may seem unlikely to Americans, but I observed that during our trip, my fellow travelers did, without exception, dispose of all metal, glass, or paper and plastic refuse in the appropriate bins. That they did so without they did this without the embarrassment Americans would experience was my first introduction to the rigid practices of recycling and reuse upon which Ecotopians are said to pride themselves so fiercely. By the time you notice you are underway in an Ecotopian train, you feel virtually no movement at all, since it operates by magnetic suspension and propulsion. There is no rumble of wheels or whine or vibrations. People talk. There is a clink of glasses and teacups. Some passengers wave to friends on the platform. In a moment, the train seems literally to be flying along the ground, though it is actually a few inches above a trough-shaped guideway. My companions told me something about the background of these trains. Apparently, the Boeing company in Seattle, at the time of independence, had never taken seriously the need to diversify its output from airplanes into other modes of transportation. The world market for new planes had become highly competitive, however, and luckily the Ecotopian government, through its long-range economic policies, called for a diversification and decentralization of production in each city and region, took temporary advantage of the Boeing facility to help build the new national train system. While the Germans and Japanese had pioneered in magnetic suspension systems with linear motors, Boeing began production on a system only a year after independence. When I asked how the enormous expense of the system had been financed, my companions laughed. One of them remarked that the cost of the entire roadbed from San Francisco to Seattle was about that of 10 SSTs, and he argued that the total social cost per person per mile on the trains was less than that for air transport at any distance under 1,000 miles. I learned from my booklet that the trains normally travel about 360 kilometers per hour on the level. Use of the metric system is universal in Ecotopia. You get a fair view of the countryside at this speed, which translates as about 225 miles per hour. And we only attained that speed after about 20 minutes of crawling up and over the formidable eastern slope of the Sierra Nevadas at what seemed to be less than 90 miles per hour. Donner Pass looked almost as bleak as it would have to the Donner Pioneer Party who perished there. We made a stop at Norden and picked up a few late session skiers. A cheerful bunch, like our skiers, but dressed in ragged attire, including some very second-hand looking fur jackets. They carried homemade knapsacks and primitive skis, long, thin, with flimsy old-fashioned bindings. The train then swooped down the long canyons of the Sierra forest, occasionally flashing past a river with its water bubbling, blue-black, and icy between the rocks. In a few minutes, we slid into Auburn. The timetable, which graphically lays out the routes and approximate schedules of a complex network of connecting trains and buses, showed 3 stops before San Francisco itself. I was glad to notice that we halted for less than 60 seconds, even though people sauntered on and off with typical Ecotopian looseness. Once we reached the valley floor, I saw little of interest, but my companions still seemed fascinated. They pointed out changes in the fields and forests we passed. In a wooded stretch, someone spotted a doe with 2 fawns, and later a jackrabbit caused great amusement. Soon we entered the hilly country around San Francisco Bay and shot through a series of tunnels in the grass-covered, breast-shaped green hills. There were now more houses, though rather scattered, many of them seeming to be small farms. The orchards, fields, and fences looked healthy and surprisingly well cared for, almost like those of Western Europe. Yet how dingy and unprosperous the farm buildings looked, compared to the white-painted farms of Iowa and New England. The Ecotopians must be positively allergic to paint. They build with rock, adobe, weathered boards, apparently almost anything that comes to hand, and they lack the aesthetic sense that would lead them to give such materials a coat of concealing paint. They would rather cover a house with vines or bushes than paint it. The drabness of the countryside was increased by its evident isolation. The roads were narrow and winding, with trees dangerously close to the pavement. No traffic at all seemed to be moving on them. There wasn't a billboard in sight, and not a gas station or telephone booth. It would not be reassuring to be caught in such a region after dark. An hour and a quarter after we left Tahoe, the train plunged into a tube near the bay shore and emerged a few minutes later in the San Francisco main station. In my next column, I will describe my first impression of the city by the Golden Gate, where so many years earlier, Americans debarked to seek their fortunes in the gold fields. Well, that was very charming. Ecotopia by Ernest Callenbach. Check it out when you get a chance. It's short, very easy to read, very funny and pleasant. A lot of people staring at deers and smoking weed. Not too different, I think, from the California many of us inhabit and want to continue inhabiting. So I want to end this quarantine bedtime story time to thank everyone again for joining me tonight. I hopefully will be coming back again this week. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mikhail, and I want to end tonight with the greed of Hisik the skunk. Hisik the skunk and his wife had a daughter who, when she grew up, married Huel the gray fox. Gray Fox was a good hunter, and he and Skunk, who was chief, often hunted together. Not far from Skunk's home were two high hills standing side by side. In the narrow gap between them ran the trail of Sokoi the elk. One day Skunk told Gray Fox to hide in this narrow place while he went down to the plain to drive up the elk. So Gray Fox hid there, and Skunk went down near the elk and fired his terrible scent. The elk could not stand the smell and ran up the trail. Gray Fox waited until the leader and all the others had passed between the hills, and when the last one had gone by, he stepped behind them and fired his arrow with such force that it shot through the whole band of elk, killing them all. When Skunk arrived at the scene, he was so glad that he danced. He called all the people to come and help carry the meat home. Then he said to Gray Fox, "You must pack one elk, and pack me too, for I am too tired to walk." Gray Fox was afraid of Skunk, and so he did what he was told. He lifted a big elk on his shoulder, and Skunk climbed on top. Skunk danced on the body of the elk all the way back to the village. Then Skunk told the people to skin the elk and cut it into strips, and he would give them some of the meat. They skinned the elk and cut the meat into strips and hung it up to dry. When they were done, they went to Skunk and asked him for their share. Skunk refused to give them any, but said that they might eat acorn mush and pinole. That's pine nuts. He then turned as if he were going to shoot his scent, and everyone was afraid. Skunk was so greedy that he would not give any meat to anyone, not even his own wife or daughter, nor his son-in-law who had killed it. He put it all away to dry for himself. The next day he told Gray Fox to hunt again, and they did as before. When the elk were in the narrow pass between the hills, Gray Fox shot his arrow and killed them all, just as before. Then Skunk called the people to come and carry the elk home, and he made Gray Fox carry one, and then he jumped on top and danced all the way back to the village, just as before. Then Skunk called the people to come. Then again, the people were told to skin the elk, and he would give them meat for supper. But when they had skinned the elk and cut up the meat, he told them, "Go eat acorns and pinole." And at the same time, he turned to frighten them. Skunk took all the meat to dry for himself, just as he had done before. The people were very angry, but they were afraid to do anything for fear that Skunk would shoot his scent and kill them. They talked the matter over for a long time, and finally a wise man said, "What are we going to do? Must we hunt for him and pack his meat and skin it for him always and not get any? We'd better kill him. But how can we do it so that he will not shoot his scent and kill us?" Then Two-Wick the Badger spoke. He said, "We can kill him." And while the Skunk was watching his meat so that no one could take any of it, Badger dug a big hole and built a fire in it. Someone asked him why he had made a fire, and Badger replied, "Do you not know that Skunk is a great dancer and loves to dance? We will have a fire in the hole and cover the top with sticks and leaves and earth so that he can't see anything. Then we will send for him to come and dance. And when he dances, he will break through and fall in, and we shall kill him." The people looked at each other, and they answered, "All right." When it was dark, they sent a messenger to Skunk. He said, "You are a great dancer. We want to dance tonight, and we will pay you well if you will dance for us." Skunk was pleased and answered, "All right, where shall I dance?" They took him to the place, and pointing to it said, "Right over there." Skunk began to dance and sing. Everyone said, "Good, you're dancing well. Keep on, you are doing finely. Go ahead, you're surely a great dancer." And they flattered him, and he kept on, and he danced harder. He was proud, and he wanted to show them what he could do. After a while, when Skunk was dancing hardest, the sticks broke, and he fell into the hole. The people were ready. They had a very big rock, which had taken many people to bring. They were waiting, and the moment Skunk fell in, they pushed the rock quickly over the hole and held it down. They all climbed up on it and held it down tight so Skunk could not get out. The hot coals burnt Skunk's feet and made him dance. He was very angry and shot his scent so hard against the side of the hole that it pushed mountains up on that side. He then turned the other way and shot his scent again so hard it pushed mountains up on the other side. After his scent was gone, the coals burnt him and killed him. Then the people were happy. The next day, the people had a great feast, and they ate all the elk meat they wanted. Legends of the Yosemite Miwok. You can probably tell there's a theme in these stories, a lot of dancing. The ground of California has a lot of vibrations in it for dancing from thousands of years. I hope y'all are dancing in your houses during the daytime, and I hope y'all dance in your dreams tonight. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time. Sleep well, everyone.